Hello and welcome to this short video on some foundational terms that we'll be using for the rest of this class. As a reminder, you will be able to pause and start this presentation at any time so you can get your notes down or just replay something that you need to hear again. So with that, let's hop right into it. Okay, this is a class in the American Constitution, so we might as well at least define Constitution. So here's our definition: document, written or unwritten, that defines the legal scope and authority of an entity or institution. Now, if you notice, this definition is very generic. They even have out to the end of it, government, church, civic organization. So if you think about your own personal lives, your church or civic organization you may volunteer with, how many times have you heard someone say, well, that's not in our bylaws, or let's check the covenants? Well, that's really just another term for a constitution. So in general, a constitution is just a document that establishes the authority, of what an organization can and can't do. So even within your church, the bylaws or covenants, they define what that church can and can't do. That way you just aren't making up the rules as you go along. Okay? Now, when it comes to types of constitutions, there are two types. The first, codified constitution. This is something you will be very familiar with. This is what we have in the United States. You see the definition here. Typically, a single document, which is the primary source of law, supersedes statutory law. So first of all, think of all the times in your life when you've heard someone say, well, that's not constitutional, or that is constitutional. So what are they really saying? What they're saying is that our general understanding of the Constitution and interpretation of it, whatever it is we're looking at, is either consistent or inconsistent with it. So we're always holding up this overarching document, the U.S. Constitution, to determine what our government can and can't do. All right. Now you see down there, supersedes statutory law. What's statutory law? That's just a piece of legislation passed in Congress or a legislative body. So from that understanding, what we're saying is Congress can't just wake up tomorrow and pass a piece of legislation that changes our basic understanding of what our government can and can't do. Now, there's a different process for that. We'll talk about that later in this course. But we have this Constitution that defines what our government can and can't do. And again, flip to the back of pretty much most textbooks in political science. You're going to see it there. And so that is a codified constitution. It is a written constitution that defines what a government can and can't do. Now, the other form is uncodified constitution. This is probably something you aren't familiar with, unless you are British. Product of evolution and many documents or events that produce guidelines and authority of a government. May not necessarily supersede statutory law, but may be a product of it. Okay, so what does that mean? So in the British tradition, you can't just open up the back of a textbook and find their constitution. It's not going to be there. Their constitution is unwritten. It's really been developed over centuries. This event, this document, this piece of legislation, it's all been put together to give them a general understanding of what their government can and can't do. Just like us. The only thing is you don't just have that one document that you can hold up and say, here it is. Okay? And where I just said in our tradition, Congress can't just pass legislation to change our understanding of what our government can and can't do. In their tradition, the British tradition, yes, you can. The perfect example of that is the English Bill of Rights of 1689. We have a Bill of Rights. It's a part of our Constitution. They have a Bill of Rights that was just passed by Parliament. It functions pretty much the same way, but it's a piece of regular Joe legislation. All right? All right, now let's move on. Some additional foundational terms to get us started. Sovereignty. This is a term we will be getting back to over and over and over throughout this course. Authority to act independently. Ability to make policy decisions without needing permission or concurrence from another source. Now, just think about this for a second. There are two ways to think about this. If you think about most of the countries around the world, most nations, Do they have to refer to another government before they can act? For the most part, no. Some do. All right. The United States is sovereign. Other nations are sovereign. They can act independently and make policy without turning to someone else, to have that blessed. One example we always think about that's a good, just a good example of when a nation isn't sovereign. France during World War II, when they were occupied by Nazi Germany, they had the Vichy government, the Vichy regime. Well, even though they had a government established, they had to go through Berlin and the German government pretty much to set or create any policy. So they were not sovereign. Now, I've said this over the years. This, to me, though, is probably the best way to think about sovereignty. Okay? I've got a couple teenagers, okay? Until they get up and out of my house and a job with benefits, they are not sovereign. Final decisions rest with me and their mother, okay? So for those of you who have kids out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They are not sovereign. So if you want to put it in these terms, a country that's not sovereign isn't an adult yet, okay? So just be thinking about it in those terms. Another foundational term, legitimacy. It's at this point I want you to start thinking about some of these concepts that we're covering, that I want you to look at them through a new lens. That's because some of these things we've been taught our whole lives. I want you to look at them with a fresh eye. A basis of authority for a government that is generally accepted. All right, so I'm just going to pop off a bullet point list here. Okay, so popular sovereignty. This is the belief that all the power rests with the population, with the citizens. This is what we believe. This should be pretty much automatic for those of you who are listening to this. But there are other sources out there in the world. Not everybody believes in popular sovereignty. Fear. If you get a wild hair and want to major in this stuff, you study the former Soviet Union, Soviet politics, Nazi Germany, their politics. Systematic use of fear to control the population and allow the government to maintain power. Divine right, if you remember from your Western Civ course. A certain family, God has granted them the authority to rule, and that is handed down through successive heirs. All right. Military. There are some governments around the world that is their primary source of power, controlling the military. And then lastly, as an example, again, this is not the end-all be-all list, but theocracy. Some governments are based on religion. All right. So anyway, let's hop on to one. And please replay this video as needed. Otherwise, we will see you in the next installment. Thank you.